Hello, everyone. My name is Mona El-Kafif, and I'm the Director of the Urban Design Programs at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. I'm extremely excited to welcome you all today to our final keynote address by Billy Fleming. Powering a just global energy transition, a Lithium Trilogy. This three-part event is a part of a larger research project entitled Lithium Territories that investigates the socio-environmental, spatial, economic, and temporal entanglements of the just energy transition. This academic initiative is a collaboration between Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, the University of Michigan, and the University of Virginia. The project is sponsored by a grant that co-PIs Maria Arquero, Ayla Berman, Alejandra Bosch, and myself received from the UVA Center for Global Inquiry and Innovation to build a larger network of experts in the field and integrate these topic areas into our curriculum. Our joint research agenda addresses a pressing global challenge, the mandate to take climate action and reverse the path towards a planetary collapse. Using lithium is a critical matter in powering the energy transition. We examine its life cycle from extraction to manufacturing, consumption, and recycling to understand socio-environmental and economic relationships. By connecting our cell phone terminals, electric cars, and batteries to lithium mines in Chile, manufacturing plants in the Asian Pacific region, and gigafactories in the US, we hope to trace the global flows that power energy aspects of our lives and transform ecosystem and livelihoods globally. This symposium was co-organized by Professor Jimena Arizaga from PUC, Maria Arquero from Michigan, our two graduate research assistants, Zarking Leo and Meredith Hoos, and myself. I'm handing it over now to Maria, who will provide a very quick synopsis of our three panels, and Alejandra, who will introduce our keynote speaker for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mona, and welcome to all of you. I'm beyond excited to welcome also Billy Fleming with us today. As we embark today on our keynote lecture closing the symposium, we would like to offer a brief recap on our three previous sessions. In the first session, devoted to extraction, Professor Jimena Arizaga invited us to travel to the landscapes of Salar de Maricunga and Chañaral in the Chilean Atacama region. Professors Jorge Valdez, Jerry Marambi Alfaro, and Osvaldo Moreno shared their work centered in landscape conservation efforts and design establishing more sustainable practices towards the future. In the second session, manufacturing, I was honored to host Professors Matthew Siebert, Marina Otero-Bercier, and Scott Campbell. They shared with us their critical visions for the just green energy transition, calling for the prevailing hyper-consumption of resources to turn into a hyper-stewardship of our planet. We learn about energy, water, and land, and all that goes into the production of lithium batteries. We also learn the devastation that these processes bring to the host communities and their landscapes. Our speakers, far from being pessimistic, invited us to think how we can work towards a future less reliant on more extraction, more manufacturing, and thicker infrastructures, and more grounded in the economies of care. Our last session, consumption and recycling, discussed the strategic innovations that steward more resilient lifestyles. With lithium demand increasing worldwide to power a green new future, our panelists examined the processes of urban transformation fostered through the integration of intelligent and not just smart technologies. We asked our speakers, Gary Conning, Sarah Mills, and Brian Kominek, if there are opportunities to improve urban landscapes and environments through more conscious consumption and enhanced practices while addressing climate change. In specific, we discussed area-wide installations of utility-scale solar farms and conservation practices and other approaches to enhance biodiversity. And this brings us to today. Passing it to you, Alejandra, so that you can introduce Billy Fleming.
Thank you, Maria. It is with great honor that we welcome Billy Fleming as our keynote speaker today. Billy is the Wilks Family Director of the McHarg Center in the Weitzman School of Design, a senior fellow with Data for Progress and co-director of the Climate and Community Project. His fellowship with Data for Progress has focused on the built environment impacts of climate change and resulted most prominently in the publication of low-carbon public housing policy briefs tied to the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act introduced in 2019. He's a co-founder of the Climate and Community Project, an interdisciplinary applied research practice that links leaders and demand from the climate justice movement to the progressive legislators. He's also a co-director of the Design with Nature and a Blueprint for Coastal Adaptation, author of Building Post-Carbon Futures and Drawing America, and co-principal investigation of the Megapolitan Adaptation Coastal Hub, a major interdisciplinary research cluster based at Rutgers University and founded by the National Science Foundation. Thank you very much, Billy, for being here, and we are very happy to listen to you.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Alejandra, for that lovely intro, and to you and your colleagues, Maria and Mona, for the invitation. Very, very excited to be here with you. So let me pull up some slides here and get us going. Cool. So have kind of, pretty roughly titled this Building Just Post-Carbon Futures, Rare Earths and Material Commons in the Energy Transition. I am going to talk a little bit about lithium, but I'm going to talk much more about the kind of full suite of rare earth elements, critical minerals, transition metals, these terms that get used kind of interchangeably and are related but different. And their supply chains, their supply matrix, the places they come from, where they go, and all those sorts of things that implicate lithium, but are perhaps a bit bigger of a frame in terms of the material that we're interested in. And this is tied to a couple different books that are, one of which is almost done, one of which is just getting started, that I'll talk some more about as I kind of get going. So, I mean, of the many reasons I think, really excited to see the symposium come together, and also really, I think, honored and excited to get asked to be part of it, is because this exact framework that you all have set out here is precisely how I think about internationalism and climate justice kind of bound up together in the energy transition. And so this is an image from a project a bunch of students and I worked on over the course of about 3 years here, called a Field Guide Towards an Internationalist Green New Deal, or Field Notes Towards an Internationalist Green New Deal, which is looking at some of these key bits of technology, lithium-ion batteries, solar photovoltaics, supermagnets, which are the things you need to make data centers work, and their material ecology, essentially, which again is kind of the focus of this event. And did that for a few reasons I'll kind of get to, and we can talk some more about at the end of this. But the two big ones were, one, that we had done a bunch of domestic work in this sort of area, and pretty rightfully had a cadre of international students and colleagues who were asking why not the rest of the world. What happens in the US obviously has profound impacts to the rest of the world in a number of ways, especially in resource communities. The other is that we really wanted to push back on this myth that mining and extraction in this industry are relatively minor concerns, which is often the line you get from eco-modernists when you talk about wanting to attend to these complications of the energy transition. So the way we sort of frame it in there is thinking less about supply chains and more about supply matrices. So as a conceptual and managerial tool, the supply chain as we understand it today emerged in the 1990s and remains the foremost method for thinking about the movement of materials, labor, products, and other commodities. But supply chains only appear to work as well as they do because of strategic gaps in our knowledge about them and how they work. These gaps show that this way of imagining and managing supply chains bears little resemblance to its actually existing forms. And that what we mean by this is there's just a lot of slippage, a lot of unknown, and a lot of uncertainty in every aspect, in the labor, the material, the economy of the supply chain. And we tend to lean on the matrix as a more useful metaphor for thinking about it. That work, in a way, comes from Thea, who I'm sure you've talked about over the course of this symposium, Thea Riafrancos, who political scientist in Providence. I'm lucky to get to do a bunch of work with, but her project is really built around lithium extraction and mining and processing and deployment through technology around the world. that work's evolved from thinking about Chile and the Atacama to now including a bunch of other sites that are in conversation with it, some in Nevada, some in Portugal, others around the world. And Thea's work here has been really important to my understanding of this body of knowledge, in helping me understand why this rush to onshore the supply chain in the US and Europe is happening, which is a bit counterintuitive for a couple of reasons. But Thea here, I think, helps us understand a bit more about it, writing that the political economy of lithium is marked by two striking developments. One, global North governments that have historically offshored mining are now onshoring lithium to enhance their supply chain security. So this is a product of two things, COVID and supply chain issues that emerged from it, but also the sort of simmering Cold War with China that the US is stoking. Second, these governments have committed to sustainably sourced lithium, whatever that means. The mining imperative appears to pose a zero-sum choice between decarbonization and the protection of ecosystems and communities. However, lithium supply is not an objective parameter, but a spatially and temporally dynamic relationship between deposits, scientific knowledge, technological innovations, and public policy. Demand, likewise, is contingent on myriad factors that determine the resource intensivity of our energy transition. And this bit of work, it was sort of fed into a larger process, a larger bit of research at the Climate and Community Project that Thea led for us, which is also, this is probably a report you've talked about, you've seen throughout the course of this symposium, because this is maybe my favorite thing I've ever been a part of that we've put out here, but was really organized around the idea that we're asking all of the wrong questions when it comes to the realization or the implementation of the energy transition and the actualization of climate justice in the built environment. So far, that conversation has tended to be organized around questions of how much of these critical minerals or rare earth elements exist in the Earth's crust, and then how do we go about extracting every single molecule of them? It's a supply-side approach to developing the energy transition across the supply chain. We wanted, and Thea especially wanted, to ask questions around demand, namely, how much lithium or cobalt or neodymium or so on do we actually need? And how does that volume change if we think about a few different scenarios or pathways to a post-carbon future? In this case, we wanted to look at how demand for lithium might shift if we reorganized our public transportation systems in the US around transit or mass transit, instead of the sort of ongoing plan, which is to replace every existing personal vehicle, which is, combustion engine vehicle, with an electric car. So 280 million of those on the road by 2050. A lot more lithium than if we were to do some mode shifting in transportation. This is probably not a surprise again. This is something I'm sure you've talked about the last few weeks in here, but this is what the Joe Biden administration is sort of laser-like focused on. It's not carbon emissions per se, it is the mining sector and building it up within and beyond the US. So lots of things here I could say about this, but just to pull forward from one of the memos that these images come from, a total of $92 billion has been invested in the US battery supply chain since Biden took office in January 2021. One of those investments is via an Israel-based specialty minerals company, ICL's LFP cathode material plant in St. Louis, Missouri, which was re-reported in a few other markets afterwards. There's a $400 million project that's half funded by a grant from the federal government through the infrastructure bill, with another $2.8 billion coming through other legislation through the IRA and via the Department of Energy, all of which is going into the Rolite Ridge project in Esmeralda County, Nevada, and some of the processing facilities that are now being developed in Texas and other parts of the US. And this matters a great deal for lots of reasons, this onshoring effort, because historically these supply chains have relied on remote mining and resource communities, intentionally left underdeveloped, often by their colonial powers, in order to make the logistics of intervention more complicated, if not impossible. And by that, I mean that remoteness in places like the Atacama, in places like South Greenland, in places like Bayan Obo, creates a set of conditions that imperial powers and colonizers can exploit. They're free there from the scrutiny of media and NGOs. They are operating in logistically complex sites that require significant time and money just to access. And they're often doing so under the protection of paramilitary forces that can and often do just about anything they want within these places. This work is featured pretty prominently in this exhibition that some colleagues here organized a couple of weeks ago and is now, I think, due to do a little bit of traveling. This is a grant, part of a grant project that I was on with some media studies and communication scholars. Some of who you might know, Ingrid Burrington, who's at Delaware with Julie Klinger now, and lots of other folks. But this is basically about this supply matrix of the energy transition, the sites of extraction, of stockpiling and refining, of end-use deployment, and of discard or waste. And the way that exhibition is framed is that it tries to draw connections between the 4 primary sites, or 4 categories of sites, that underpin this larger research of the digital and energy transition. And have some student work in there from last year. A bunch of architecture students at Yale have their work in there. But I wanted to bring that up just because I think all of this work is indebted to several people. Thea is one of them who I've mentioned. Another here is Jane Ma Hutton, I think, who wrote one of, if not the most important books in landscape architecture of the last 20 or so years, called Reciprocal Landscapes. And among many other things, I think Jane gives us a really compelling way to see the energy transition, even though she's writing more about conventional landscape projects like Central Park. She writes, "The word reciprocal is not intended to soften, conceal, or suggest equanimity between sites of production and consumption. Rather, it's used in an aspirational sense, that when joined with landscape, it suggests the inextricable interdependencies that humans share with the more than non-human world, that consumers share with producers, and that all beings share with each other. To do so challenges understandings of materials as inert, and this alone is an important starting point for seeing materials as more than just stuff to use." And at least for me, there's no real path to understanding this process without the work of Jane and the idea that there are many somewheres and someones and sometimes bound up in the materials that compose our built environment. And that to produce, truly just or sustainable design, we have to attend to those other places and peoples and times as much as we can tend to our commissions themselves. Another person who's, I think, been incredibly, important to this work is Martin Arboleda, whose intervention really helps us understand the globe through the eyes of an industrial mining operator. I'll pull another quote forward in a second here, but he also writes that the dispersed fragment of the planetary mine are therefore dialectically bound up to the pipes and cables tucked into the high-rise buildings of the mega cities that have sprung out of nowhere in South China in just 20 years. In the myriad electronic gadgets spawned by vertically integrated electronics manufacturing systems that have led to factories in Shenzhen employing up to 420,000 workers, a figure no automobile factory in the heyday of Fordism would ever have dreamed of, and in the holds of containers of the thousands of cargo vessels that make up the maritime commercial fleets of China, Japan, and South Korea, which have rendered the Pacific Ocean into the main infrastructural corridor of world trade. And to go a little further, he goes on to say that mines that have been abandoned are now being reopened, that deposits deemed uneconomical are being transformed into large open cast or open pit extraction sites that are almost fully automated. The planetary mine is the geography of extraction that emerges as the most genuine product of 2 distinct transformations. One is a new geography of late industrialization that is no longer tied to the traditional core of global capitalism in the West. And a second is a quantum leap in the roboticization and computerization of the labor process. So all of the same sorts of labor-breaking technological innovations we've seen in the automobile industry have also come to mining and many others. They're coming to architecture as well. And this is all happening, as the Biden administration is making this push, not to replace global South mining, but to add to its footprint. So all of the mines that we've talked about, and I'm sure you've talked about, or again, over the course of this symposium, whether we're talking about cobalt in the Congo, or we're talking about lithium in Chile, or we're talking about neodymium and praseodymium in South Greenland, the Biden administration is not interested in shutting or slowing any of that down. They're interested in adding to that supply by building and developing new projects in the US and Canada that are easier for them to control and to access. This is also true in the EU. And in 30 years, I'm at this point quite confident we won't talk about the Biden presidency as one that had anything really to do with climate or infrastructure, or even bridging generations. We'll talk about it as the single most important presidency to the mining industry in 100 years. Part of that, if I can get this to go here, part of that is because of a desire to compete with sites like this. This is Bayan Obo in Inner Mongolia, China. And part of the positioning of the Biden administration beyond supply chain security is stoking this Cold War with China. They're interested in doing that through the energy transition because at the moment, this site, Bayan Obo, is where anywhere between 70 and 80% or so of all rare earth extraction and processing happens on the planet. This is the bottleneck for global supply of rare earths, including lithium and others. One of the Biden administration goals is to build enough of this kind of capacity in the US that we can take half or more of that market share in the next 15 years. And in that regard, we're well on the way because these new facilities are breaking ground in Texas and throughout the Southwest now, often in the billions or tens of billions of dollars in terms of capital investment. That bit of extraction work is happening as others within the administration and outside of it. In this case, this is a part of a report from Jesse Jenkins at Princeton that I'm sure folks who are familiar with, which is beginning to lay out scenarios for building the using the end use technology. So the solar panels, the transmission corridors, the battery farms, and so on of the energy transition, and trying to think through where from a land use optimization perspective, they make the most sense to build. This is one of the scenarios they've developed that's now become the playbook for the Biden administration as they start handing out grants and federal funding and through finance and other instruments to build some of this either transmission capacity or generation capacity or storage capacity. And that as we think about extraction, one of the arguments that often gets levied against it, which is not particularly true, but nevertheless it persists, is that it's not particularly land intensive. It's a small operation, minimal sort of impacts on the environment. We know that's not true, but that's one of the lines that gets thrown back at us when we talk about wanting to limit extraction to the amount we need versus the amount we know is there. But that's just on the extraction side. This is just the image you're looking at on the land use transformation, or in this case, the generation capacity on the deployment side. And in the next image here, what you're looking at is the volume of land area in the US, in each state, under a relatively conservative renewable energy development plan that will have to be transformed for energy production by 2050. So this isn't storage, this isn't transmission, this isn't extraction, this isn't waste disposal, this isn't manufacturing. This is just where the solar panel's going to go, where's the carbon capture or carbon dioxide removal technology going to go, where are the transmission lines going to go, and how much of the country's or each state's land area do we need for those things, and what kind of land will be converted as a result. And you can look at some of the hotspots there. Missouri jumps kind of off the map. Texas jumps off the page. Iowa, Illinois, some of the other Midwestern states jump off the page. This is if you're in one of these places or care about one of these places, this is the plan that the Biden administration is now putting into action, is to instrumentalize the landscape of these places for renewable energy production, which is a good thing in general, but also comes with a whole host of other challenges, given that these projects will have to be approved by, implemented by local governments. And the number one bottleneck to building this kind of generation and storage capacity in the US is local land use conflicts. So basically NIMBYism, folks who don't want to look at wind farms or battery farms or solar panels, which is actually a pretty important design challenge. And this rush to onshore, again, isn't about displacing extraction or production. It's about expanding it, re-instrumentalizing the globe for energy production, a move that will make the monitoring of sites like this in the Congo, in the global south, and other resource frontiers even more difficult than it already is. And of course, we should know what some of the more historically complicated examples of this in the US have looked like, right? It's not that we'll be doing extraction work on Long Island. We will be doing it in places like this. This is a shot from an erstwhile uranium mine on Navajo land in the Southwest. Long and very tortured history of the U.S. using this reservation land and public land as sites of extraction and waste disposal. You can still go through parts of the Southwest here in the U.S. and find rivers that are not permissible to even go near, let alone enter or drink or catch fish from because of uranium tailings. These are the kinds of sites where this extraction in the U.S. will begin once again. It's not going to be on valuable land. It's going to be on marginal land like reservation and public land in the Southwest. And of course, this is, again, looking not just at the mine, but at the network of sites that are bound up in it. Some of these, again, looking at tailings ponds and accidents. One here, again, a Navajo Nation in the American Southwest in the top right, looking at the Mount Holly copper tailings pond in Canada, in Bristol Bay. In the bottom at an abandoned coal mining town and copper mining town in South Greenland. And in the right, at basically lithium stockpiling and tailings ponds in the Atacama. And in the bottom left, I'll just say, I'll talk a bit more about Greenland, and we can talk endlessly about it if folks want to. But this is, it has a long and troubled history with colonialism and mining. Those mining towns are all the products of forced relocation. So Greenlanders being kicked out of one town, forced to live in another and work in the mines. And then when the mines are inevitably abandoned, so are the people. And this is a place now that no one lives. People go to take Instagram photos there. But of course, there are all kinds of, I think, really compelling. It's easy to go into one of these conversations and just focus on all of the bleak aspects of it. And sometimes I'm guilty of that. But there are all kinds of, I think, springs of hope here of incredible indigenous-led resistance efforts around the world. And I mentioned Greenland. One of those here is Urani Namik in the top left, means uranium no thanks in Greenlandic. Greenland is the largest contiguous indigenous nation on Earth. It's the largest island on Earth. It's the largest ice sheet outside of Antarctica on Earth. And it's also it's home to the second densest collection of rare earth elements and critical minerals on Earth after Bayan-Obo. And nevertheless, Urani Namik, as a group of activists, remain undefeated. They've turned back every mining operator eventually that they've ever encountered in the region. And I can say the same about lots of other folks you see on the screen here. And of course, those are extraction sites, wasting sites. These are the stockpiling sites. This is one outside of Perth in Western Australia. This is what a giant pile of lithium looks like, essentially. And of course, once it leaves that place, it goes to a place like this, which I'm going to play just a really short clip of this video, one of the new EV manufacturing facilities in the US that recently came online. So let me pause talking for a second to let this play.
114,000 Rivian customers are waiting for trucks and SUVs just like these, and many have sat on that wait list for more than a year.
Currently, we're in body shop. This is R1 body shop that we're looking at right now.
The electric vehicle company is now burning through cash, rushing to fill those orders. It's a startup trying to prove it can build vehicles at scale without having ramped up before.
It definitely is a pressure that's felt. It's felt on the floor. It's felt by the entire team.
So what is the company doing to build faster? And can it become what investors want it to be, the Tesla of trucks, before its competition? I toured Rivian's plant and visited Ford's EV facility to find out. Rivian's factory in Normal, Illinois was previously home to Mitsubishi, which built cars here until 2015. Remnants of that facility, like a large part stamping machine, remain. But much of the plant and the process for making Rivian's three vehicles, the R1T, R1S, and Amazon-branded commercial van, are new. As is Tim Fallon, who was brought into Rivian in February after 16 years at Nissan.
What's job one right now?
Job one right now is I'll say, I don't want to say finishing the ramp, I'll say continuing the ramp and getting to stability.
Maybe define for us what stability means in a factory.
Stability to me is I want all of my team members, technicians to come in and see the exact same thing they saw yesterday, the parts in the same place, the right number of parts, everything running appropriately, and really being able to get into that rhythm and really do the dance of building vehicles.
That starts with stamping. From there,
so I could let this play much longer, but the only other thing I'll say there is that video pulls a couple things forward. One is the supply chain challenges that come from making electric vehicles, and one of the many reasons to think about modulating our demand for lithium by investing in other forms of transportation. The other is that, in the US, all of the incentives are stacked towards building the largest and buying the largest EV possible. So if you want the most generous tax credit as a small business owner in the US, you can't get it for buying a Prius, you can't get it for buying a Bolt, you can't get it for buying a Tesla, but you can get it for buying an electric Hummer, you can get it for buying an electric SUV. And so all of our incentives are stacked towards maximum lithium demand, and that's why we're on the resource intensive transition pathway that we are now on. So just to continue a couple more quick examples here, this is the Ningxia agrivoltaics project in northwestern China. This is, a piece of a complicated and troubled piece of infrastructure. It's trying to do a lot of things. It's trying to push back on creeping desertification in that part of China. It's trying to intervene in the food system. So this is why you see them, basically setting up row crops here. And it's trying to be an energy producer for the province, for Ningxia. And, is one kind of imperfect example of what this kind of world could look like if we go down, again, the most resource intensive pathway imaginable. And of course, again, I'm sure this is a topic you all have talked about. I know it is because I've seen some of the material. This is what an e-waste site looks like, and the informal economy that is organized around it. And you go to a place like this in Ghana, you go to Zimbabwe, which has absolutely no rules about who can dump what wherever they want to. And there's no sort of guidance or education from local or national officials about how to even deal with this material when you encounter it. There's all kinds of diseases of despair that are springing out of these things. And of course, I bring that forward. I bring all of these disparate sites forward for you just because this is a version of the image we get promised by folks who may not call themselves eco-modernist, but are, I think, pretty obviously eco-modernist. And this belief that we can sort of technologically solve every one of these problems in ways that create a win-win-win scenario for everyone. Obviously, that's not true. This is, even in this image off screen are the sites of extraction and waste disposal and processing that are not in the foreground here. So thinking about this energy transition is far more complicated and messy and dirty, actually, than images like this kind of lead us to believe. And again, I think to just talk about a couple of other quick examples here of what this could actually look like built into practice in the world. These are some of the kinds of projects that are at the core of one of my book projects I mentioned earlier, which is the same title of this talk, Building Just Post-Carbon Futures. That book's organized around 35 or so projects like these that are attempting to highlight, to document, to hold up as imperfect examples of the kind of world that Green New Dealers, climate justice advocates, and others want to build. In Canada, you probably know the way that the Canadian government is thinking about implementing their Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So their attempt to basically think about ways to make or deliver reparations for colonization and genocide in Canada has been to build their energy transition and to hand the benefits of it over to First Nations and tribes. So one of the new rules for all of these federal energy projects in Canada is that 51% or more have to be owned by First Nations. We could talk much more about that if you'd like to, but these are a few projects that came to me via someone named Douglas Robb, who's a now faculty member at the University of Calgary. He's an energy landscapes and decarbonization scholar, one of the most interesting folks in the field that I've ever met, and pulled some of these projects forward for me. So Tudeka geothermal, district energy and heat plant owned outright completely by 24 tribes in Canada. Same for that one in the bottom right there, transmission corridor owned outright by the tribal nations whose lands it intersects, and all the benefits that come from those projects then flow to those tribes in terms of financial and energy benefits. And then the other two that may have come up in conversation here the last few weeks as well. One of those is Orca, the sort of first large industrial scale carbon dioxide removal operation in the world. It's attached to the second largest geothermal plant in the world, which Iceland has abundant resources for, and is now kind of being piloted in a few other places around the world as a place. It's located in a place with abundant baseload power that allows it to be then a CDR sink. And then the other is an abandoned mining site in the Tennessee Valley, a former TVA-related coal mining site. This is one of the kind of dirty, not so secrets about the TVAs. It's one of the biggest coal and gas consumers in the U.S. As a utility. But one of their former coal mines, Raccoon Mountain, so a mountaintop removal site, you can see there, was converted into what's called a pumped hydro storage facility, or a very low-tech battery. So, this is a site in which when it's powered by a mix of things, hydroelectric power from other dam sites, and then also wind turbines that are on the ridges throughout Appalachia. When the wind blows too much and they produce too much power that they can't use, it pumps water uphill into this reservoir to store it. And then when the wind inevitably dies down and there's not enough power for their consumers, they release the water, and it spins a turbine and works the same way that a battery farm would. But it reuses a toxic site and does it in ways that are far less materially and technologically invasive, which is interesting in a place like Appalachia for a lot of reasons, but primarily because it's a site where mountaintop removal is everywhere, and where the end uses for those mountaintop removal sites are about as bleak as you could imagine. They tend to exist in one of three forms. One is as sites of continued abandonment, so they're just mountaintop removal sites with nothing on them. A second is that they become monoculture savanna or grassland plantings that are then sort of left to be there on their own and become wildfire risks. The third is that these abandoned mines become prison facilities. So because they're flat sites, they're easy to build on. So that's one reason why prisons get built here. The second reason is that there are specific programs in the states, in Kentucky and West Virginia, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania, as well as federal grant and loan programs that explicitly send money to prison construction in these communities. And so they get built on the best building sites, which are the flattened mountaintop removal sites. And then the third is that you don't have to remediate those sites if you want to put incarcerated people on top of them. And so this is one of the afterlives for those sites. And I always like to include the Raccoon Mountain example in this conversation, because this is not a fait accompli. This is not the only way we can remediate or use these sites after they've been extracted in this way. And we're going to have to find other things besides prisons and grasslands and abandonment to do with them, because we have a lot. This is just as of 2019, so it's a little dated now. These are the active and speculative rare earth element and critical mineral mining sites around the world. This is kind of the geography of existing and aspirational extraction. And obviously there are many different mining sites within each of these dots. And they're all going to require, the amount of these that we develop and actually extract from will depend on how we answer questions like how much lithium do we want instead of how much lithium exists in the world. And then the other question of what we do with all of these sites after they're done will get answered by, I think, folks who are able to make a compelling argument about a site like Raccoon Mountain versus a site like USP McCreary, which are in the same region. They're both in Appalachia. They're both extant coal mines. One is a hydroelectric battery and one is a carceral facility. So, I'm going to talk really quickly here to begin to wrap us up about this report, which I know has probably been broached a couple of times here over the last couple of weeks, but this is when I mentioned, for Thea, for us putting together, looking at a bunch of different sites in her set of new field work that's tied to a new book she's just wrapping up called Extraction. But again, tries to connect the conditions of the landscape, of the ore, of the people, of the politics in sites in Nevada, in Portugal, in Argentina, and in Chile, where lithium extraction is either already well underway or in the very quick ramp up to it in the case of Nevada. And in it, among many other things, pulls forward a couple of lessons that are really important to this conversation. One of which is just in the pull quote there, which is, the results of the modeling we did for this project demonstrate that both increasing the ease and availability of other forms of transportation and charging and changing EV design, so making them modular, can significantly influence cumulative demand for lithium-ion batteries and the lithium that's required to produce them. So in this report, we're talking a bit about demand-side extraction. We're talking a bit about enhanced recycling and reuse procedures, but often we're talking about specifications, in this case of the battery itself, right? Which is standard in most other industries to have a model or a universal specification for a piece of technology like this that's so integral to the functioning of the economy. But because we live in kind of a right-wing hellscape in the US, we don't do things like that. So we have this privileging of individuality and companies each having their own proprietary battery design, which is a problem for a million different reasons. But one of those is that it makes it impossible to really have any recyclability or reusability program work as intended in the lithium-ion battery industry. And of course, one of our goals at CCP is always to translate that research into actual sort of action. We've done that around public housing and transportation. I won't belabor the points on these reports, but these are things that were done kind of independent of, but then very quickly picked up by folks like Bernie Sanders and AOC, and in other cases, Jamal Bowman, Rashida Tlaib, Omar Ilhan, and others, to think about how we push cutting edge research like this into model legislation, and how that model legislation then gets carved up and inserted into things like the president's omnibus spending bill, or the next surface transportation reauthorization, or whatever other opportunity we get to really shape policy in this area. And that work shows up in a bunch of different ways for me in the center as well. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this, but we've only been talking about renewable energy production here and the various nodes within it. We haven't talked a lot about the sort of movement of people. And a huge other component of this, in the US at least, is this competition for land that is coming, even in a land-rich country like the US, which you're looking at here, excuse me, is the existing energy sort of system of the US, at least as of 2018 in this case, or 2017. And what you're seeing are all the generation, transmission, and storage facilities, most of which are built entirely through unregulated private markets until the 60s. That's how most energy infrastructure was built in the US. To do this via a less dense energy source like wind or solar or other forms of renewable energy, you have to build a version of this that's 2 or 3 times as large, because you need that much more generation and storage and transmission to make it work. And that's just, again, on the energy side. If we were to do all of that with just the generation with wind, this is kind of the volume of wind and the best areas to do it that way. It's kind of a silly exercise, but a way for us to emphasize just how land intensive these operations are. That's not even getting into the need to actually pull a bunch of the carbon that we've already put into the atmosphere out. That can be done through very small operations like the Orca project I mentioned in Iceland. The challenge for that is that those projects are incredibly capital intensive, and they also require massive amounts of energy to make them work. So you can build a carbon dioxide removal plant or project that's powered by a standalone, coal-fired power plant. And then at that point, what are you really doing if that's the way you want to power these things? So Iceland is lucky you can do it with abundant geothermal and hydroelectric baseload power. The US will have to develop new versions of that to build enough CDR capacity to pull any of that stuff out of the atmosphere. And in the meantime, that means because those operations are so difficult and expensive, that most folks have kind of thrown themselves into this fantasy that we can tree plant our way out of the climate crisis, right? That we can just plant enough trees and suck just enough carbon out, that we can then also reuse those trees to maybe build some CLT-based housing. There's this lovely circular economy story we tell about it. The issue is that, one, again, the most land and water intensive operation imaginable is a tree planting plan around carbon sequestration. It's been disastrous as an intervention in other parts of the world for that reason. But the other is that these trees don't actually sequester carbon on a timescale that makes any sense for us. And you can go back, the number of reports that have been sort of produced now that have been auditing the offset forests that were built in the 80s and 90s and 2000s as ways for us to basically buy tax credits or carbon offset credits for ourselves when we jump on a plane or as a university want to lower our carbon footprint to get to net zero. What we found is that actually most of these offset forests only sequester about 40% or so of what was promised. So they're underperforming by 60 or so percent. And even the carbon they do sequester, most of it is in the biomass. It's not in the soil. So when you lose the tree, you chop it down, you burn it, you do other things with it, you re-release that carbon back in the atmosphere. So this is just a way of emphasizing there's a lot of competition for land, and this is talking about all the people on the move. This is an image from a project called An Atlas for the Green New Deal we put out a few years ago. This image itself is looking at Matthew Hauer's work. Matt's a climate geographer based at Florida State, the first person to really count up the number of structures and then the number of people who will be literally underwater under the different sea level rise scenarios. So this is the most conservative map you could imagine. This is just how many houses and how many people will be literally underwater by 2100. It's not getting into how many places just upland from there will be uninhabitable because they flood so regularly, or because so many people in their jurisdiction have had to leave that they're now financially insolvent. But Matt's the first one to go in and count all this up and then attach that to a demographic model to get a sense of where they might move. And again, because we live in a mostly unregulated housing market, it allows for people to move from one very flood-prone location to another. Also, by the way, those are sites where we're going to have to build new renewable energy capacity. So there's a lot. This is all a way around to saying there are lots of things on the move that matter in this conversation beyond just the extraction, beyond just the production, beyond just the wasting of technology and rare earths. And this shows up in lots of ways in the project I mentioned earlier, Field Notes Towards an Internationalist Green New Deal. I won't talk endlessly about this, but just to point folks towards it as a resource for thinking about all the different sort of nodes or topics that we're touching on here today that have a place in any conversation around what a just transition or climate justice could or should look like. And we play around with a bunch of weird little things in there trying to help people understand where bits of technology that are important to the sort of functioning of their everyday life, where they come from, how they get used, and what the consequences of pulling these things out of the ground can have, because almost every rare earth element and almost every critical mineral that you would ever want for any piece of technology that's important to the energy or digital transition is almost always co-located with radioactive material, with uranium, with thorium, with, you know, things that have half-lives that are longer than humans have existed on this earth, and probably will be existing in that form long after our species is gone. And, you know, just to begin to kind of wrap us up here, you know, this work for me has been connected now to some other work I've done around extraction and exploitation in other parts of the US. So, you know, thinking about power generation, thinking about extant or erstwhile extraction efforts here has been a theme for me and my group here for a long time. In this case, a group of folks a few years ago and I looking at former plantation sites that have been converted into either fossil fuel generating facilities, so refineries, processing facilities, or to prisons. So if you look at Angola and Parchman, the two largest prison farms in the world, larger than the island of Manhattan, in Louisiana, Mississippi, they're former plantation sites. And like many former plantation sites that became prisons, the transition of those to state ownership came with the former plantation owner being the warden. That's where Parchman gets its name, as the Mississippi State Penitentiary. He was the plantation owner and the first warden. And beyond that, beyond just the sites themselves, they are now also, as you surely know, sites of surplus labor for a bunch of different industries throughout the Gulf. Critically to this conversation, to the offshore oil and gas infrastructure of the Gulf. So, you know, in the Gulf of Mexico, much of what you might see or encounter or otherwise know about there was either built or is still to this day maintained with convict leasing labor coming from one or more of these facilities. There's a robust sort of subsidy regime in place for building those things. I won't go into a ton of detail here on this, but again, this is, you know, partly about getting folks to think about our choices here, right? We have made very purposeful decisions to stand up this particular industry in a particular way, in a particular place. We're now making a similar set of decisions as a country on the rare earth extraction and processing side. And we don't have a great history, I think, of doing this kind of stuff well, and requires much more attention in order to do well and in limited capacities. I'm not going to talk a ton about this, but the last thing I'll say here to kind of begin to wrap us up is just to say a couple quick words about Greenland, which is a place that isn't on most people's radar unless they're interested in like polar bears or like National Geographic, I think, because it's often imagined by the public and in popular writing as an empty place, a place with ice, perhaps with ore, perhaps with fire, perhaps with charismatic megafauna, but not with people and not with places that matter. And, you know, this is, as I said earlier, Greenland is the largest island on Earth. It is the largest contiguous community of indigenous peoples on Earth. It's about 60 or so thousand Inuit people who make up the population here, a couple thousand Danish folks who also work there, and a few other sort of folks from other places. And it's also home, as I said, to the second densest collection of rare earth elements in the world, and has a very long and troubled history with imperialism and colonial sort of practices around mining and extraction here. We can talk lots more about. But also one of the weird quirks of Greenland is South Greenland is kind of where I've spent most of my time. It's been around the Kvanefjeld mining site. This is a site that was a former uranium mine in the 1960s and 70s, used by the US and European or US and Denmark or Danish governments for their weapons and energy programs, and was decommissioned in the 1990s as the result of a bunch of organizing effort from a group of activists called Irani-Namik, who I sort of mentioned earlier, who were able over the course of about 20 years to build enough power to win enough seats in parliament to pass a ban on uranium mining in Greenland. One of the first truly sort of acts of independence or sovereignty as they slowly build towards a truly sovereign state that's independent of Denmark, although they're still not there. And for 30 some odd years, that mine was essentially left abandoned above the town of Narsaq. But in 2014, a team of Danish geologists discovered the core samples here. They discovered the rare earth element deposits, and in very short order, the global mining community descended on this place and began applying for, and in some cases winning, exploration licenses to redevelop the mine and to use the town of 1,200 people or so's drinking water supply as the tailings pond. So there's a lake called Lake Tasic above Narsaq. That is where the company has proposed doing its or storing its tailings from this mine. And, you know, I've been involved in work there now for about 3.5 years that's tied to thinking about alternatives to mining that could take that question off the table. So what are the other economic sort of investment opportunities or development opportunities that could make mining a moot sort of question here? So anyway, that you're seeing some little snippets of that. In the top left, the video you see kind of playing on a loop is at the port to a hydroelectric facility there called Korla-Torsorok. Every town, so there are no roads in Greenland between towns. You get between places via boat and plane and snowmobile and dog sled and foot and kayak, depending on the season. And each town has its own standalone hydroelectric power plant, which is what we're visiting in this picture. We're in the valley where that hydroelectric facility operates. It's run by a gentleman named Otto, a Danish engineer who lives in total isolation. We were the first people he'd seen in about 18 months when we were there, and I don't know if or when he saw people after we left. And of course, this is, the group I mentioned, Urani to meet at one of their protests. This is 2016. So as the Kvanefjeld is being proposed for reopening, and you're seeing the town of Narsok kind of on the right there, smeared in fog and rain last September, as we were kind of getting ready to depart to head back to the US. Just a quick little shot of that town. So I'm going to let that play for just 1 second so you get a little bit more of a visual. And then lastly, again, these are, thinking back to, I've mentioned this book project a couple of times. You've seen versions of these images a couple of times now. This is the CDR and geothermal plant in the top left in Iceland. I mentioned Orca and ON. The top right is a German project called Firstpugler. It's part of their IBA program, which is its own really interesting post-extraction, post-carbon sort of national government program. We can talk more about if folks want. Bottom left is the transmission corridor I mentioned in Canada, and bottom right is the Raccoon Mountain project. And just to kind of end us here, because these are the questions that the book is organized around. These are some of the questions I think we may want to work through today, or at least take with us after today. But really, this book is organized around those projects and then asking folks to respond in different ways to these questions. One of which is, what can we learn from prior eras of state-led investment or transformations in and of the built environment as our energy transition unfolds? What are things we might want to hold on to or find ways to adapt to the 21st century? And which is most other things, what other things do we want to just sort of discard and never reproduce in any form or fashion? And the New Deal is, an interesting moment to think about that question. The second is and this is more of a domestic question, so for US sort of development, how do we begin to think through the tensions between this need for or desire for expedience and our hopeful commitment to practicing democracy? And by that, I mean, how do we imagine being able to build the most stuff we've probably ever built as well and as fast as we've ever built it to meet all of the different benchmarks or timelines we've set for ourselves in a way that doesn't just flatten and steamroll people en route to building the energy transition? This is why folks in the US, when they talk about permitting reform, typically are just talking about deregulating land use to the point where you can build anything you want, anywhere you want. And then the last question here, which is more internationalist in its orientation, is what might it mean for the rest of the world, for the West, to continue down its current energy transition pathway, which is the most material intensive pathway imaginable. That is the one we're on, and that requires if we continue down it, to basically strip mine places like South Greenland, like the Atacama, like Portugal, like Bayan-Obo to the bedrock, because there's no way to do anything else where the only question that matters in those conversations is how much is there versus how much do we need. So with that, let me take my slides down and stop talking for a while and turn things back over to y'all. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Billy, for your presentation. I think I'm not sure if there's say. I'm going to try to translate this say that you left no rock moved in the subject. There, you touch every thread of subjects that we wanted to address in our symposium, I guess. And I think it's really interesting how there is this shift from this consequential landscape towards this Green New Deal idea of dealing with these subjects. I want to give the opportunity for people in the audience to ask some questions. And perhaps I have some questions from the students of the Taubman University for starting the conversation. And it says, since the LSA tepid 2019 response to the Green New Deal, have ALSA leadership developed their position towards the goal and mandate set forward? If so, do you think their position calls for the kind of professional landscape architecture revolution you've advocated for? This is the first one.
Yeah, this is a great question. So as I understand it right, I think the question is basically asking, like, what has ASLA done or learned in response to some of the G&D stuff for the last few years? Well, look, I think it requires to be able to like understand what I'm going to say, maybe, which might sound harsh. You have to understand like why ASLA and AIA exist as organizations, right? They don't exist to be on the leading edge of really anything. They exist to serve their members. They're a professional society. They're always going to be, I think, more towards the median or conservative sort of place that the profession sort of covers than they are on the sort of leading edge of it. That being said, they weren't a hard group to convince to throw some support behind the Green New Deal, but they also weren't a hard group to convince to throw support behind things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, anything that comes from DC that includes jobs and contracts for landscape architects, they're going to be excited about. And in fact, when you look at groups like AIA, they've gotten better about not trumpeting this stuff lately. But, you know, as enthusiastic as they were about the Green New Deal resolution and about the Inflation Reduction Act, they were also that excited to help Trump build his border wall. They were also that excited that AECOM and HOK and a bunch of the other multidisciplinary practices basically float their budgets on prison construction and pipeline construction. So I think for them, like part of how I understand their politics is that they are a jobs program for their members, which I understand. I think it's really frustrating, but I'm also like, I get why they operate that way. One of the nice things about like having the job I have and being not like out in a firm anymore is that I don't have to like worry so much about those things. And often what I spend my time doing with students is trying to help them think through alternative career paths for themselves, if that's not a place that they want to go, right? If they don't want to go work at a firm whose primary objective is like profit accumulation at any cost, at any like expense, where else might they go and make their skills useful? Some wind up in government, some wind up at nonprofits or think tanks, some wind up at, you know, design offices, and some wind up in like places that have nothing to do with the built environment, at least in like obvious ways. So I think like they've been willing and great partners when it has suited their interests, which are jobs for landscape architects. And they're also, I think, understandably like ready to move on to the next thing when it looks like there isn't an immediate contract boom coming from the Green New Deal for their members.
Thank you.
Maria, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, thank you, Alejandra. Billy, thank you so much for the talk. As Alejandra just said, you help us connect so many different dots that sometimes feel, you know, challenging to connect and, you know, at times overwhelming. Just for you to know, students have been sharing with us a lot of questions because they are always shy to speak, I don't know why, in public. So we are going to be sharing some of those little by little. But I want to maybe invite some of the students to don't feel like they need to have the smarter question. This is a good opportunity also to share with you some of the things that we have been going through in the through our studios. So this semester, we took on a trip across the Nevada and California landscapes. This is particularly important because first, we are a very international studio section. Out of 13 students, 12 of them are coming from all places, all geographies in the world that you can imagine. And I think something that we all share in common is our urban experiences, but not that much what is that space, that other space that is where most of the production of what we consume in our comfortable urban settings is coming from. And I think this traveling across the geographies that have been traditionally geographies of extraction, but also the geographies where we put things once we don't want them anymore, has been eye-opening. And not only eye-opening in the sense of obviously experience the incredible immensity of the Nevada landscapes, or the very contrasting, we went from Reno up to Salton Sea. So our version of California is very, very special. But it was interesting to almost negotiate with different times. When we are talking about how can we contend with this acceleration, this always more is more, and we need more and more and more. And then, we were visiting many of these mining sites that it felt like stuck in the past, right? And it's not only that they're the temporality, they seem to have died at some moment in time, and then we keep them as relics. Is that the way in which these landscapes have become relevant cultural landscapes of some of their residents, and how they tell their stories, and how they, how they share those with the visitor. And then a completely different reality that you were pointing at. We visited one of the mining sites that has been closed for a long time. It's a gold mine in Goldfield that now is being reprospected, because what was waste a few decades ago is now very profitable, right? And here, just to share one of the moments in which I felt like the group felt more in shock. Here we were talking with some of these very young miners. These are folks that are as young as our students, that are making some sort of $35 to $50 per hour. They work for a month, they stop for 15 days, and they seem to be also coming from all over the world, very much as our students. And obviously they were sharing with us a very different set of, priorities and needs, and almost like not a way of justifying why they are doing what they are doing, but almost like returning back to us, what do we think our comfort is coming from? And if we want to maintain our lifestyles, what do you think, guys, are we doing here? And making sure that we can keep extracting so that you don't lose your comfort. So it was, one of these moments in which, on one side, we readjusted the imagination that many students have on this notion of mining being something that only old folks and, people who live in this strange rural landscape deal with, because many of the people that were in that prospecting stage were actually coming from all over the world too. They were really, really young. And, this opened a lot of interesting conversations. And obviously, we also saw a lot of what is yet to come in the Lithium Valley in California, and how incredibly challenging is to imagine that more manufacturing can go in what is already an incredibly struggling landscape. And obviously, what are super fun sites that are connected to some of the mines that are not in use anymore, but also, what are the mines that are currently extracting lithium. So just to say that listening to you, making all those connections today was almost a way of revisiting this transect that is very much at the heart of the US, and I would argue is an incredibly space of learning right now, if we dare to contend with all these different realities that are negotiated there. So just to share with you some of the thoughts, some of the questions the students are going to be sharing now are going to be also on your work, because they have been investigating you and your work. But just to share a little bit in words and not in images, how we have also been trying to make real the current existing challenges that this more is more is presenting here in the US. Sorry, I took too long to just share this, but in case the students feel like, this is an opportunity to also share with you some of their thoughts and not just, questions.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I'm happy to respond to a bunch of, that's such an interesting, I think, download, but I'm also, I don't want to take up space if folks do have questions. So I'll pause, or I'll just vamp for a second and pretend like I'm not going to talk or respond to Maria, But if you all have questions, like you should do what Mona's doing. You should either like raise your hand. Often when I'm in like class with students, I'll have them keep stack in the chat, right? So you can just do this and write stack and we can call on you. But I think, yeah, Mona, your hand's up. Do you want me to just come to you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Billy. I mean, first up, thank you. This was an amazing presentation that, as Maria and Alejandro stated, crossed through all the topics that we are trying to get our head around. My students are working in the last cycle on an assignment. It's called Mining the Sun, and we are really trying to understand what it means to implement what the solar need in the future will be. I was really impressed to see your overview of the different states and the footprint of land that needs to be converted in order to even address what we will consume in the future. Virginia was listed but it was still very small, and we are already shocked with the solar plants that are going to be implemented here around Charlottesville. So our attempt obviously is, first of all, don't try to take down the green land, but settle on gray land. But if you need to settle on green land, you need to do this in the most multifunctional and multi-beneficial way as possible, including the non-humans that are currently living there. So it's really fantastic to see how you address the different topics. The question that I have is an umbrella question, because what we recognize during our readings and all the discussions with the local developer, Woodridge Solar, who is very collaborative and actually wants to do the right thing, is to understand that all of the green energy transition, except for a couple of exceptions, and I'm happy to see the Raccoon Mountain, for example, as an example, or Orca, they are all tapping into the old mechanisms of the fossil fuel energy. The more, the better. The more profit, the better. The faster the profit, the better. And it is also nested in the existing power structure that the fossil fuel energy era generated globally as well as locally. Whoever owns the land has more power. Whoever has the most capital at the moment has most power. Crashing into the situation that we don't have enough ordinances to actually organize how we can do this in a more just and fair manner on site. Just discussing the lack of solar ordinances, for example. Out of your perspective, I mean, you had showed one slide where you said there's hope for there to be optimistic with a series of global pilot projects. That's exciting to hear. It's also exciting to hear that there is resistance from the indigenous population, specifically in these remote areas. What do you think we can do? And what do you think as consumers, as well as professionals or future professionals out there in the world, to strengthen that this is really becoming a just transition? Because it seems like an overwhelming problem.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for that, Mona. And the way I'll answer it is partially how I was going to answer Maria too. But before I do, let me just ask: do you have Holly Jean Buck's work like involved in any of this stuff? Do you know Holly? So Holly's a sociologist. She does kind of rural energy landscape work. She's based at Buffalo. She's written. She has an MFA and a PhD in sociology, so she's by far the best writer in like the entirety of academia. Like her creative writing is incredible, and also just like is a real treat to read. I think the book that I always think of for her, which is less germane to this, is called After Geoengineering, which is basically a choose your own adventure book, academic book that she wrote, where she takes you through a bunch of different geoengineering scenarios, but it's structured the way you would read a choose your own adventure book. It's incredible. I'm like honestly still shocked today it didn't win like some national book award. But the book she put out most recently that's probably more germane to this question, Mona, is called Beyond Net Zero, or it's called Ending Fossil Fuels Beyond Net Zero. And, she takes as her kind of central premise in that book, a different but related sort of topic, which, she's concerned with how do we manage the decline of the fossil fuel industry? How do we manage it into obsolescence or into non-existence? And, one of her big concerns there is that, we can all, and even fossil fuel companies can see a very near-term end to the use of fossil fuels for most of our power, for most of our electricity, for most of our cars. But they've known that for a long time. And so they've gotten very busy and have remained very busy building up the petrochemical aspect of their industry, right? So single-use plastics and all the other things, like sitting here today, my glasses, my AirPods, my hat, this pen, my shirt, my socks, my shoes, all have petrochemicals in them. And they have made their industry so indispensable to the functioning of society that even if we end fossil fuels as a fuel source, there's not really a plan in place or a sort of horizon in sight for ending petrochemical sort of single-use plastics. Every single product on your house is coated or made with them. And I think about that like in similar ways to I think your question, Mona, for like what do we do on the consumer side? And I think the answer is like you can try your best, but the answer is almost always going to be around breaking industrial scale power or regulating it. And I say that because, I think there's sometimes a quick reaction in these conversations to just be like, well, like either keep everything in the ground, rare earths, fossil fuels, whatever, and figure it out. That's where degrowthers tend to sort of go. Or like to just assume we have to do this at an industrial scale and it's going to be terrible for a long time. And in 300 years, we'll be glad we did it, which is kind of how eco-modernists feel about this. The reality is like for as long as humans have existed, we've done extraction work. We've been pulling stuff out of the ground and using it for a variety of purposes for as long as we've been able to like make tools and use them. That's distinct from extractivism as like a mode of operating, right? As a political economic arrangement in which the only question that matters there is profit accumulation, to your point, Mona, and is about, identifying reserves of material that, are in the ground, that are worth a lot of money, and that we then can either pull immediately out of the ground, or we need to invest money in our R&D that allows us to build new technology that can do that for us. So this is one reason why some of the former mining sites that I think Maria mentioned are now coming back online, because we've developed new technology that makes it possible for us to recover material that wasn't possible to recover before. Another reason is that, some of those mines, the things they were developed for initially, maybe like fluorspar or cryolite or gold or bauxite or something like that, was exhausted or could have been exhausted. And so they closed the mine down. Or much more likely, there could have been a shift in material use. So one of the big like challenges in the renewable energy sort of industry for manufacturers is something called material substitutability. So for lithium, it's less of a concern. It's the most efficient mineral that we've like ever found for battery storage. But for almost all other aspects of the energy system, like the things we're pulling out of the ground now to make panels and wind turbines and all the other things we need, they may not be the things we use in 10 or 20 years. We might find a new element. We might develop a better way of extracting or using a different element. And so, a country like the US might stockpile what it thinks is a 30-year supply of something like praseodymium to make supermagnets, and then discover 5 years into that, after all of that investment, that actually we can just use like nickel instead for it, and that's abundant and it's no problem. I think like this question of what's going on with these mining sites is really important, because they close and reopen for a bunch of different reasons. They almost all have to do with like material substitutability or technological innovation. And those things are happening while mining operators are looking to build, mining sites that follow one of two paths now. There used to be like a pretty differentiated landscape of mining. It's now basically two types. It's open pit, mostly automated mining, where you might have a handful of people like the folks you met, Maria, who work there, and they monitor the robots essentially. And then you have also very like labor intensive versions, like I showed you a picture of in the Congo, right? Where there is no technological investment. It's just people inhaling and absorbing cobalt and other pollutants as they pull this stuff out of the ground. And, I could talk forever about all of these points, but I think a couple things just to pull forward from Maria's questions as well. Yeah, like there are really good jobs in mining for young people, just not people who live in the communities where the mining is happening, right? So this is always the challenge, is that a mine will be developed and there'll be promises of jobs, and some of those jobs will materialize, but not most of them. And they'll almost exclusively go to people who were trained elsewhere. This has been true for as long as we've had extraction, by the way. So when we developed the Appalachian coal fields, the way that we did it was we imported Black coal workers from Alabama and Georgia, who had been basically excavating coal there, and in parts of Illinois and Iowa as well. And we moved them all to Appalachia. And there's a really wonderful book by Carita Brown called Gone Home, which is about the like third and fourth generations of Black Appalachians who left after the mines were exhausted and their parents passed away, but still come back every summer, every couple summers, and meet up in these former coal mining sort of social halls to basically trade stories and oral histories about their families being relocated there and then dispersing. So this is a very long story. It's a very long way of saying, like, those jobs, like, yeah, they're great. They're not going to go to anybody who lives in Nevada or Southern California. They're going to go to folks like your students from all over the world. And that's also true in South Greenland, where the mining site I mentioned, they talk about all the jobs created, they talk about all the wealth created. None of those jobs are for Greenlanders, and they've now basically admitted as much in court. This is a thing I didn't mention. Greenland is not sovereign. It's a colony of Denmark, and so it's subject to the Danish court system. And when they denied the mining operators exploitation permit in 2021, they were sued in Danish court unsuccessfully. But now, both Denmark and Greenland are being sued in international court to force them to give them an exploitation license, and they'll probably be successful. And that could happen kind of any day now. So yeah, there's a lot more I could say, but I'll stop talking there. I feel like I've been trying to respond to that inefficiently for a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is another question from Maria's students. And it says, I'm intrigued by your tenure as a policy advisor in the White House Domestic Policy Council during the Obama administration. Did this experience influence you transition from landscape design towards bringing the climate justice movement demands with the policy development process?
I mean, the short answer is yes. Probably obviously. Most of the folks that I get to work with and collaborate with are folks I met through that experience. So I could give you like a very long, like basically family tree of collaborators that all kind of begin somewhere in that world. But the folks I co-founded Indivisible with were also my roommates and coworkers in the White House. Many of the folks who I collaborate with now on research, so Daniel Donna Cohen, Thea Ria Francos, Julie Klinger, and others are folks I met while I was in that job, either because they were, within government somewhere or doing work that I thought was interesting to the work we were doing and became kind of colleagues and then collaborators. And also, I think is part of why like this job has been like fun at times for me, because I get to I get to use an institution with some resources and some power and some credibility to point my field in like different directions than it might otherwise go. Because I mean, you know this, you're in graduate school for architecture. Our field is very small and very insular, architecture and landscape architecture and city planning. And so most everybody knows everybody. Most of our collaborators and friends and colleagues and even partners are in the same industry. And that's lovely for lots of reasons, but it also means it can make some of this kind of collaborative work more difficult than it has to be. And most of my sort of connections in that regard are outside the field, because I spent so much of my professional life outside of it. And it means I probably think about this a little bit differently than some of my colleagues, but I also have access to a bunch of different people and sort of fields of knowledge or bodies of expertise or sites even than folks in my field typically are pointed towards. And yeah, I think it would be impossible for me to pretend like that experience didn't change how I think about all of this stuff, how I get to work on all of this stuff, and how I get to like wind up getting a job like this where I get to play around with a bunch of this stuff. I see Charlotte and Elia on there as well, if I'm saying your name correct. Yeah.
Yeah, Charlotte is raising her hand.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Billy, thank you so much. I apologize, I was a bit late, but I am so thrilled to have caught the last hour of your talk. And I was first exposed to you and your work through one of my recent obsessions and fascinations, which is the book written by Matthew Cyber, Atlas of Material Worlds. A fascinating book, and I am actually embarking this year on my master's thesis, which deals with post-extractive, post-mining sites in the Intermountain West, specifically in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. I was there a few weeks ago exploring this territory, which is almost entirely covered in abandoned mining claims. So I'm really interested in like rendering visible the kind of latencies of the landscape, the social, ecological, economic histories that, you know, birthed like this region of totally oriented around extraction. And this talk has made me think a lot about the way that the kind of extractive unconscious and like the deterritorializing of extraction operates within this global capitalist system, but also like very specifically within geographies. Like, you know, Maria was talking about these sites in Nevada and Southern California, and I'm wondering if, you know, I'm working specifically in this, you know, beautiful mountain range, right? But has this really, this like unearthed, unspoken history, like, you know, within the strata physically, but also in this like conscious of the place. And I'm wondering if you thought at all about the future, kind of projected futures of these types of abandoned sites, these post-extractive sites, right? No longer used, like they're used for something else potentially, or I don't know. I just wanted to get your kind of thoughts on these, like after extraction, you know, this state.
Yeah, no, thanks for this. This is such a great question. And I'm sure Matt talked about his new book probably when he was with you as well. So The Dark Side of Green. Yeah. So I'm also very excited for that one. I'm writing something for him in it, but I'm really excited to see what else is in there. I think there are a few things I'll just point you towards, Charlotte, and obviously we can talk more like after today as well if you want via email or something. One is that there's a federal program that's going to be really important to you if it's not already. It's called the Abandoned Minelands Program, or AML. Yeah. So this is basically the repository for every abandoned mining site that's been cataloged or documented in the U.S. I've just had the numbers in front of me because I wrote a chapter for a book called Technical Lands that's about the AML program. But I don't have them in front of me. It's like 1.5 million acres of AML sites in Appalachia alone, and something like $10 billion in deferred remediation costs. That's not even including any kind of upgrading costs after you remediate the toxic sites. But you know, there's a lot there in the AML program that I think you're going to want to dig into. It deals specifically with all of the abandoned uranium mining sites in the Southwest and the Intermountain West. And then, you know, there are a couple other places I think that you'll like enjoy poking around in. One is there's a journal that's now sadly, I think, like done, but called Scenario, that my colleagues Nick Pevsner and Steph Carlisle used to put out. There's a specific issue on extraction, and I think Matt has an essay in there. If not, lots of other landscape folks do. That probably will be like important to what you're thinking about here. And the other thing I would say too is, you know, this is maybe related to, I think, Maria's sort of point earlier about the different ways that, you know, abandoned mining sites get memorialized or interpreted over time. You know, big pieces of that are like how those things get interpreted and remembered in like public consciousness are often the product of like industry propaganda or state, like, you know, whitewashing essentially, right? And I think about that. I'm thinking about that right now just because, you know, the group that I just took to Greenland for a studio trip, we went through Copenhagen, which is the site of like the Greenlandic diaspora. It's where most Greenlanders who have left and can't or don't want to return are now kind of stuck. And they had a fantastic new exhibition up at the Louisiana Museum that was done by and for and with Greenlanders. And the title of it was A Memory Over History. And it was focused on beginning to document and foreground the oral histories of Greenlanders about the impact that mining and colonization and other forms of imperial control, sort of whether it's by the military or scientific experimentation, how those have shaped like Greenlanders' lives, their past, their presents, their futures. And that's how I would that's the frame I would encourage you to think about in your own project, is less about like, what's the accepted history that's been written about this by the mining operator, by the state of Nevada, by whoever, and what are the actual stories about what this place meant and still means to people that you want to foreground and build your project around.
Totally. Thank you so much. No, that's amazing. I spent 2 days at the archives in this small little town. They have over 10,000 documents about mining, and not one of these documents that I could find in their database talks about the seizure of land and displacement of indigenous people, right? Like there are these narratives that are perpetuated and those that are obscured. Anyways, thank you so much. I would love to, I'll email you.
Okay, yeah, the last thing I'll say on that is just, and I know there are other questions, It's just, like, just because you mentioned archive, I often think about mining sites, these deposits themselves as archives. And I think about Greenland as an archive, right? Like the ice sheet that's at the edge of town where the mine sits is 250,000 years old. That's what the ice like age is right there. And it's literally, we drill cores in it because it tells us, important information about past climatic and geologic and biologic sort of events. The same is true for the rocks. I don't know how old the ones in Intermountain West are, but the ones in South Greenland are like 3 billion years old. And there are very deep, thick, compressed histories of like human and non-human and like biotic and non-biotic like relationships in those rocks in the earth. Those are things we pull out of the ground, some of them intentionally like coal, and some of them unintentionally like thorium, which is a byproduct that comes with much of this stuff. And once they're out, like, that's it. The archive is gone, and like the consequences are what we get to deal with. So for coal, it's CO2 in the atmosphere. For thorium, it's 15 million years or so of radioactive half-life.
I think Ilya had raised his hand, but there is another question from Ahmed that I will read. It says, hi.
I'm
See?
gonna jump in because students need to go through to thesis now at once. So if you don't mind, then has Ilya to share, and then maybe we should wrap up gently. Also, considering Billy's time. Sorry that I interjected, but
it's fine.
No, it's cool. I'm having so much like fun. I lost track of time. So yeah, I do need to run very shortly.
Hello, Billy. Thanks for the presentation. It was quite insightful for me, and I believe for my colleagues also. In our trip to Nevada, we're kind of looking at abandoned mines, like different mines. And so we're kind of trying to see how we could situate a project, like an intervention around those mines. And then what it means, what happens after mining, right? Like those mining endeavors. And in your book, The Blueprint for Coastal Adaptation, you address all those challenges associated with post-mining activities, and I was quite fascinated by that. And so I was wondering if you could expand more on those pivotal factors. So like, what are the factors that you feel are like the main factors impeding, I guess, the remediation of contaminated sites? And then additionally, you mentioned how some of the remediations include the building of facilities such as prisons. So I was wondering if there are certain interventions that you deem fit, like recommendations that you have for interventions on this post-mining site, I guess.
Yeah, these are great questions. I'm going to try to go fast, but again, if you want to like follow up with me via email, please do.
Okay.
So maybe to go a little bit like backwards, the like question of what you do with some of the mining sites, let's just say in Appalachia, right? These are mountaintop removal sites that now have prisons built on top of them, which is like a horrible thing, but also creates some interesting like post decarceration and post carbon like future opportunities. One of those is that every prison built in the US after 1989 or so has to be on a microgrid. So it has to be able to withstand like a regional blackout and keep the lights on and keep the facility going. So they're operating on the kind of grid we say we want for a renewable energy system in many places, which basically means if we decarcerate and shut down the prison, based on the average size in Appalachia, we can power a town of about 3,000 people today with their existing generation resources. But they also happen to be the best sites in Appalachia for building anything, including new renewable energy generation and storage, because they're flat and they're on the top of mountains. And often they're very well reinforced because they're former mountaintop removal sites. And so, I've had students in studio basically work with a group of prison abolitionists and fossil fuel supply side, activists to think through how you might decommission a prison, how you might transform it into a rural electric co-op, and how you might build enough new renewable energy generation and storage and transmission capacity with a bunch of jobs for those now decarcerated folks. To basically power Appalachia completely on renewable energy or primarily on renewable energy by 2050. And those are like the kinds of things I think, there are lots of technical and political and financial constraints too. But look, you're in an academic design studio. Everything you do is speculative anyway. And I wouldn't let those things that make it hard to build a project tomorrow keep you like from imagining what it should be 50 years from now. That's the point of a studio like this, is to push all of us to think beyond like what we might be able to do tomorrow and what we should do, the day after it. And you had another question in there, but I've completely lost it, Ilya. I think it was about cleanup, right? You're muted, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess what's like the major factors mitigating cleanups of contaminated sites and old mines? So is it like government policies, or is it that the cost of cleanups, or I don't know, or is it a technical challenge? I'm just kind of curious as to what are like the major factors. I know on one side there's there hasn't been much awareness, but then on the other side, I feel like there may be some other factors that even if the government wants to do it, I guess it's a bit challenging, right?
Yeah, I'm pulling up something here from a lecture I just had in studio the other day, just to show you, because it's, I think, going to help answer part of this question. 1 sec, let me do this. Okay, can you see this weird little flow chart thing? Yeah, so what you're looking at here is the corporate structure of one of the absentee landowners of a coal operation in Appalachia in the kind of mid to late 20th century. And I'm pulling that this is from a book from John Gaventa called Power and Powerlessness. It's about kind of the story of Appalachia's kind of colonization and development and extraction activities. But it's in here, he pulls it forward because what he's really writing about is kind of an answer to this question. He's saying, like, how is it that all of these abandoned mine sites can be so toxic and so unaddressed and so otherwise like pervasive in the region? And one is that because all of these companies are structured in a way that allows them to essentially close the shell corporation they created to own the mining site, to go through bankruptcy and decommission it and put the land into receivership and make the state or the federal government responsible for its cleanup. They're supposed to be paying money into a trust fund that covers the cost of remediation. That amount was always set too low to actually cover the cost of remediation, and most of the operators have found loopholes to get out of paying into it altogether. So you have this, corporate structure in place that allows them to basically walk away from a mine the moment it's no longer productive. And you have a sort of regulatory environment that allows them to give the land over in receivership to the state or local government and make them responsible for its cleanup. And so that's a big part of it, is that it's not like a design problem per se, but obviously it's a policy problem that has profound like impacts on design and planning work in where you're operating. Give me 1 second. I have a student like knocking on my door. So let me go tell them I'll be just a second and come right back.
Okay, you're going to wrap this up in a second as soon as he's back. Okay. Thank you, Billy. We wanted to, express our real gratitude. This was a fantastic keynote that really wrapped up and connected the dots on many of the topics that we discussed during our virtual symposium. We would love to thank you with a big applause. I know there were multiple chats, multiple participants who posted it in the chat. Thank you. And at some point, we really love to have you back. This is an ongoing discussion, and we will continue working on these topics.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for putting this together. I know like any kind of symposium related to a class is like a big challenge, a multi-institutional one, like a million times so. And I'm just really grateful for the work you're doing, and whatever like opportunities there are to do stuff together after this, you just let me know.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Billy.
All right.
Thank you so much, Billy.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.